Every generation of wrestling has its top stars, and every generation has those characters who work just underneath those top stars, helping to hold the company up at its foundations. But while this is often a thankless task, as we've shown in our videos on similar figures from prior periods of time, it's crucial nonetheless. And that's because if there's no solid midcard to center everything, there's not going to be a show for long. But who have been the best examples of this in recent memory? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the superstars who perfected this role over the past decade or so in Cornerstones, the 2010's Greatest Midcarders. And if we're going to start anywhere, where better to do so than with a man who, in the years since, has gone on to be one of the biggest stars in all of wrestling. That said, before he was able to get to this point, Cody Rhodes was being forced to establish himself on the midcards of both Raw and SmackDown. How would he do this? Well, after coming into the decade fresh off a stint with Randy Orton's stable Legacy, the grandson of a plumber would take advantage of the fact that he'd been voted most handsome man on the roster during a backstage poll and morph into dashing Cody Rhodes. And this vain and preening heel gimmick would be enough to see him get involved in high-profile programs against the likes of Christian, Matt Hardy, and Rey Mysterio. Unfortunately, though, it would be while feuding with the latter that he would legitimately break his nose, something which caused him to alter his character again as, now wearing a clear plastic Phantom of the Opera-style mask which comically showed his entire face, he'd become undashing Cody Rhodes instead. So now, playing the man who thought he was a monster for all the camp it was worth, the youngest Rhodes' son would rise even higher up the card, with him ultimately winning the Intercontinental title in August of 2011 and reviving the classic 80s design of the belt. And from there, it was off to the races as, after holding on to the title for a while, he'd next move on to the tag team division when he began partnerships with Damien Sandow and later his own brother Goldust. Of course, while many saw main event prospects in Cody's future by this point though, one person who didn't was Vince McMahon, as instead of strapping the rocket to the youngster here, the boss would have him morph into Stardust, an anime-style supervillain instead. And as far as Cody was concerned, however, Stardust was not where he saw his future laying, especially since he'd managed to get so hugely over when he and his brother beat The Shield to become tag team champions in October of 2013. So, deciding to bet on himself then, he'd ride his contract out over the next few years, playing the character that was asked of him, all while knowing in the back of his mind that he was going to leave and reinvent himself once the time came. And you all know what happened next. Cody quits WWE, goes on a run on the Indies where he becomes a member of the Bullet Club, then becomes a founding member of All Elite Wrestling, the biggest competition WWE has seen in 2 decades. And after proving himself as a legitimate main eventer there, he's since returned to his original home where, now being pushed as arguably the top guy on Raw, it seems inevitable he'll be the one to finally dethrone Roman Reigns. Yes, it's been quite a rise for the Rhodes son. It's just a shame the same can't be said for his former Legacy partner then, as instead of rising to the next level once that group disbanded in 2010, Ted DiBiase Jr. would have a much harder time. But it wasn't like the company didn't try to get him over, as after reviving an old gimmick of his father's, he'd start bringing the $1 Million Championship down to the ring with him everywhere he went immediately upon going solo at the turn of the decade. On top of that, he'd also get to show off how popular his character was with the ladies when Maurice, his on-screen girlfriend and valet, became a regular fixture of his act too. And for a while at least, it looked like this was going to be enough to establish DiBiase as a future player with WWE. The only problem was, with the man himself feeling like he was doing nothing more than mimicking his dad, he'd instead pushed to come up with an all-new gimmick, one which would turn out to be the DiBiase Posse. That's right, now instead of playing the $1 Million Man 2.0, Ted would play something of a frat boy who regularly hosted tailgate parties with fans prior to shows. Unfortunately though, this would not be as successful, and so, after spending the next couple of years treading water in feuds against the likes of Jinder Mahal and Unico, he'd be released from his contract in September of 2013, with him from there all but retiring from wrestling and moving over to the corporate world instead. Yes, it just goes to show that sometimes, even if the industry is in your blood, you'll still find your life taking you elsewhere. When it comes to our next entry though, it's never felt like there were any other options, because as far as Cesaro is concerned, he pretty much eats and breathes the ring. Of course, this shows in his excellent in-ring performance, something he honed while building up a name for himself in the likes of Ring of Honor, Chikara, and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. So after seeing what he could do there then, Vince McMahon would sign the Swiss Superman up to a main roster contract in 2012, with him here quickly proving he had what it took by becoming the United States Champion. And after going on a lengthy run with this belt, he'd further branch out when he became a member of the tag team division upon forming an alliance with Jack Swagger and Zeb Coulter. Yes, this would be the birth of the Real Americans, a team name which was pretty comical given Cesaro's European roots. Still though, even if it did get a laugh or two, it gave the former US champion a chance to receive even more TV time, all while allowing fans to quietly start getting behind him in bigger and bigger numbers. In fact, so popular would this groundswell of support become over time that, by the point WrestleMania 30 rolled around, it wasn't uncommon to see Cesaro section signs all around arenas. So that was why, at that aforementioned show, the Swiss star would be booked to win the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, with the hope here being that it would give him that final push he needed to reach the main event spot. Sadly though, soon after this, Vince McMahon would apparently sour on his newest toy as, seemingly believing he couldn't connect with fans because of his nationality, he'd return Cesaro to the tag team division. And while he would have success there, becoming a multiple-time tag team champion with Tyson Kidd and Sheamus, there was always the sense that he could, and should, have been doing more. Luckily then, it seems like this has finally happened, as after recently joining AEW and becoming the newest member of the Blackpool Combat Club, Cesaro has finally found a more high-profile spot. When it comes to another of his former WWE peers though, he's remained in that mid-card role in Jacksonville. Of course, before he was doing this as Matt Sydal though, he was doing it in WWE as Evan Bourne. And it was while working as Evan Bourne that he first got a chance to prove himself on a larger scale, because after his earlier career saw him ply his trade in the likes of Ring of Honor and TNA, WWE would suddenly expose the up-and-comer to a much wider audience. So, taking full advantage of this, Bourne would start the decade by taking his high-flying offense to challengers such as Sheamus, Chris Jericho, and Randy Orton, the latter of which would give him a highlight reel moment with one of the greatest RKOs of all time. Then, once he'd established himself as a single star, he'd move on to other ventures when he began partnering up with Kofi Kingston, with the duo here going by the name of Air Boom and quickly becoming tag team champions together. Unfortunately though, not long after this, Bourne would be suspended on 2 separate occasions over wellness policy violations, with this stalling his momentum so much that, after losing his tag team gold, he'd end up returning to singles competition for a while. And despite hoping this would reinvigorate him once again, a subsequent motorcycle accident would see him be placed on the injury shelf for the next year, after his recovery from which the company chose to part ways with him altogether. But while from there, he would go back out to the indies to wrestle for the likes of Pro Wrestling Guerrilla and ROH once more, his tag team partner, Kofi Kingston, would remain a part of the WWE system, becoming one of the top mid-card acts of the decade in the process. Yes, after his early tag team title success with Evan Bourne, Kofi Kingston would continue to be a fixture on the title scene as, upon finding that his earlier main event run had been blocked by Randy Orton, he'd instead have to settle for frequently winning either the Intercontinental or United States titles. In fact, so many times would he win each of these belts, at a certain point it would become a bit of a meme, with fans starting to wonder if he would ever reach the next level after a while. Thankfully then, he would, though in order to do so, he'd have to return to the tag team division, as it wasn't until 2014 when he joined forces with Big E and Xavier Woods that Kofi Kingston would really get the chance to shine again. And that's because, after a rocky start for the stable, the New Day would eventually settle into a groove which saw them play the roles of pop culture quoting gamers and geeks who, despite their fun-loving nature, could still kick ass in the ring when it was required of them. From there then, they'd quickly become one of WWE's hottest acts in years, selling huge volumes of merchandise in the process as they managed to thread the needle of being popular not only with adult males, but also women and young children too. In fact, they'd become so popular that, across the rest of the decade, they'd win 11 tag team championships. But while this was a major feather on Kofi's cap, he still desired more, and that was what would push him to finally win the big one in 2018 when, after Kofi Mania caught fire, he'd be able to defeat Daniel Bryan at WrestleMania 35 to become the first ever African-born WWE champion. And he's not the only popular mid-carder of the era who would have brief dalliances with the main event scene either because, while Kingston's big WrestleMania moment marked a high point for his career, almost a decade prior, The Miz would be reaching similar heights himself. Yes, he may have since settled into a role as a perennial mid-card presence, But as the 2010s were starting, Mike Mizanin was firmly establishing himself in a main event role after cashing in his Money in the Bank contract on Randy Orton to become the WWE Champion. Of course, while many wrote him off as being little more than a paper champ at this point though, the former real-world star would have no intentions of being seen as such. And so, as the months went on and he continued to overcome the odds by holding on to the title, he'd vow to not only take on the top contender John Cena at WrestleMania 27, but also beat him and end the night still on top of the mountain. And to his credit, he would do this, albeit with a little help from The Rock, proving here that he was someone to be taken seriously after all. That said, upon ultimately losing the belt during the rematch with Big Match John the following month, The Miz would start to sink back down into a mid-card role as, with his brief main event run now seemingly over, he'd settle for becoming an always reliable heel who could draw ire from crowds everywhere and use his mic skills to help others get over. It was certainly a method which worked for him when, in August of 2011, he began teaming up with R-Truth to form The Awesome Truth. And it was a method which continued to work in the years after that when he became a multiple-time Intercontinental Champion. Hell, even when he wasn't in title contention, his heel antics would be used to great effect when he started a delusional movie star-style gimmick in 2013, with this being the one that also introduced audiences to Damien Mizdow. And when Daniel Bryan came out of retirement in 2018, there would be no better choice for his first major feud at this point than his longtime rival, the ultra-hateable heel, The Miz. But what would become of his one-time tag team partner R-Truth? Well, while he would never ascend to world title level, his journey would be similar in that it would see him fill a role which no one else on the roster could do so well. And that's because as WWE's resident funny man, no one brings the laughs better than he does. Of course, this was always evident throughout the 2010s, as could be seen in his genuinely hilarious segments, such as the times he tried to climb the ladder to success during the Royal Rumble, appeared as Dolph Ziggler's stunt double, or memorably introduced audiences to his invisible child friend, Little Jimmy. That said, it wasn't only comedy R-Truth could do because, throughout the decade, he'd also proved capable of handling himself in the ring, too. And this would lead to him becoming not only a two-time United States champion, but one-time tag team champion and one-time mixed match challenge winner alongside his dance partner Carmella as well. On top of that, he'd also make the 24/7 title his own as, like Crash Holly and the Hardcore Strap years before, this belt would become pretty much synonymous with the funny man over time, something which has led to him holding it a total of 54 times to date. So it's hard to argue that R-Truth isn't one of the most successful mid-card acts in WWE history at this point. But when it comes to his comedy stylings though, he'll always have one notable challenger for the funniest performer of his era, because while he was doing his thing, Santino Marella was simultaneously entertaining audiences everywhere with his own laugh-out-loud gags. But Santino had already been showing what he could do for years prior to this by the time the new decade rolled around. So just continuing on with what brought him to the dance then, he'd form a team with Vladimir Kozlov at this point, one which gave us the particularly memorable segment where the two hosted a tea party for Sheamus. And of course, when the duo weren't involved in comedy skits, they were still able to hit the ring, whether it be as part of a tag team or as singles performers, with them usually able to find some degree of success in each. In fact, in December of 2010, they'd briefly become tag team champions together when they won a four-way elimination tag match on an episode of Raw. Then, as if that wasn't enough, a few months later, Santino would win singles gold himself when he pinned Jack Swagger to become the United States champion. That's right, despite mostly being remembered as a funny man now, Marella was a very skilled in-ring performer, and he would show this as, over the weeks and months which followed, he successfully defended his newly won title against all comers. In the end though, a challenge from Cesaro at August 19th SummerSlam pre-show would prove to be too much for him to overcome, and so from there, now no longer having gold around his waist, Marella would return to playing his more comedic roles as he introduced fans to the Cobra, his Mr. Socko-esque sock puppet, which seemed to have a mind of its own, separate from him at times. On top of that, he'd form a short-lived alliance with Australian superstar Emma, as with the two able to play off each other perfectly, their act would become an instant hit with fans. Sadly though, this act would ultimately have to be cut short because, after suffering a neck injury which required him to undergo fusion surgery not long after, he'd decide that then was the time to retire from the ring. But luckily for WWE, just about the time his in-ring career was coming to a close, another performer was rising up to take his place, Though when it comes to Rusev, he'd be far more serious in his nature. Yes, Rusev, the Bulgarian Brute, first made his main roster splash in April of 2014 when, with his on-screen manager and real-life girlfriend Lana by his side, he'd come across like a Rocky villain brought to life. And given how much Vince McMahon got into this 80s-style monster character, it wasn't long before the big man would find himself being rocketed up the card as he underwent a winning streak which saw him pick up victories against the likes of Mark Henry, Jack Swagger, and Sheamus, the latter of whom he would win the United States title from. In the end, though, his real proving ground would come when he went face-to-face with John Cena during the lead-up to WrestleMania 31. But while he would ultimately lose the match the two had at the Showcase of the Immortals, his reputation as a killer would be protected by the fact that he'd been able to beat Big Match John clean the month prior at Fastlane. That said, now no longer the US champion, Rusev would still stumble around aimlessly for a while as he tried to find a new direction for himself within the company, with this period seeing him take part in a pretty awful love triangle storyline between himself, Lana, and Dolph Ziggler, then serving as a member of the League of Nations for a period. Once that was over, however, he'd find the direction he'd been looking for when he developed the new gimmick of Rusev Day. And standing by his side during this time would be a surprising ally in Aiden English, someone who, acting as his herald, would often announce him down to the ring. In the end, though, despite the Rusev Day getting hugely over with fans, it wouldn't have the same effect on Vince McMahon. And so, after spending the next few years growing frustrated about his spot on the card, Rusev would be more than happy to take his release when it was thrust upon him in April of 2020, with him at this point jumping over to AEW and there morphing into the Redeemer, Miro. When it comes to the man who was once chasing the affections of his wife on screen, though, Dolph Ziggler seems to have no intention of going anywhere, because as far as he's concerned, he's a WWE lifer at this point. Yes, ever since being repackaged as the show stealer at the turn of the decade leading into the 2010s, Dolph has been a main fixture in Vince McMahon's mid-card scene. In fact, throughout this time, he'd not only become a 6-time Intercontinental Champion, but a 2-time United States Champion and a 2-time Tag Team Champion as well. Hell, at points he'd even threatened to ascend to the main event scene, such as the time when he won the World Heavyweight title after one of the greatest Money in the Bank cash-ins in history. Despite his best efforts, though, a full-time spot at the top of the card would always seem to elude him, and so, with years of stop-start pushes eventually conditioning fans to see him in a certain light, he's since settled into the role of utility player, someone who could slot into pretty much any mid-card role required of him. And this, at various points then, has included him entering into a love triangle with Rusev and Lana, forming alliances with Drew McIntyre or Bobby Roode, and even going back down to NXT to help get the stars of the future such as Braun Breaker ready for the big time. So even if he's not in the main event scene anymore, Dolph Ziggler still deserves an important role on WWE TV. As for one of his former peers, however, he's since gone on to rebrand himself as a big-time player in a number of smaller promotions instead. Who are we talking about here? Zack Ryder, of course. But while he may be currently World Championship level in both Game Changer Wrestling and the National Wrestling Alliance, Ryder's first claims to success would have come in the early 2010s when he got hugely over with WWE fans as a result of his online vlog, Z True Long Island Story. In fact, so over would this period see him get that, at one point, even The Rock was drowned out with "We Want Ryder" chants during a segment on Raw. Of course, any reasonable promoter would have given him a push to the moon at this point then. It's just a shame that late-period Vince McMahon wasn't a reasonable promoter, and so, instead of trying to capitalize on one of his rising stars' organic success, the boss would pretty much bury Long Island IZ 6 feet under, having him be betrayed by both his on-screen girlfriend Eve and on-screen friend John Cena, then put in a wheelchair and wheeled off the stage by Kane. And sure, Ryder would remain with the company after this, but instead of being the star he could have been, he'd become little more than a footnote on the company's mid-card, usually acting as cannon fodder for other bigger stars and only occasionally being thrown a bone, such as with his Intercontinental title win at WrestleMania 32. But then, maybe that isn't such a bad thing after all, because, as we've seen today, in many ways, the mid-card is the most important part of any roster. And in the end then, that's what makes them all cornerstones.